Good afternoon. My name is Joe Straus, and I want to thank everyone for joining this conference. While we don't usually think of staring into computer screens when we think of conferences, it is great to connect for these discussions about our state's future. I want to start by congratulating my friend Graham Weston for his recognition at the Texas Trailblazers Luncheon, and I want to thank Graham for his many contributions to our community here in San Antonio. And I also want to acknowledge my good friend and my longtime mentor, Tom Luce, who has spent decades lending his wisdom and vision to public policy solutions. He is certainly doing that today through his outstanding leadership of the new organization, Texas 2036, an organization that is bringing much needed attention to the long-term challenges facing the state of Texas. Of course, the greatest challenge we face in the short term is the COVID-19 pandemic, something that has caused severe pain for many families while disrupting our economy, our schools, and so many other aspects of our lives. In this time of public anxiety about our health and our future, it is especially helpful to hear from experts who look at these issues from a perspective of science and data. And today, we have one of the very best experts with us to visit about the difficulties this pandemic continues to present. Dr. Larry Schlesinger is an internationally recognized authority in infectious diseases and has had a very distinguished career in scientific leadership. He's the president and the CEO of Texas Biomedical Research Institute here in San Antonio, where he is leading a transformational change process. Texas Biomed is on the front lines of COVID-19 research and discovery as we work toward finding a vaccine to prevent this virus. Larry previously served as the director of the Division of Infective Diseases at The Ohio State University, where he founded the Center for Microbial Interface Biology. He has also served on the faculty of the University of Iowa. Dr. Schlesinger is known for his effective leadership style, his development of innovative programs, and the concept of team science. We're grateful that you've taken the time to visit with us today, Dr. Schlesinger. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. And so with that, I will turn it over to the esteemed scientist, Dr. Larry Schlesinger.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker Straus. I truly appreciate the opportunity to present to this group as part of this innovative conference. And let me add my congratulations to Graham Weston for this well-deserved recognition. And thank you, Tom, for your leadership in shaping public policy. In the next 20 to 25 minutes with you today, I'd like to provide a very brief, high-level overview of the history of pandemics. I'd like to then pivot to contemporary issues in infectious diseases that are on the rise. I'd like to spend some time talking about the impact of COVID-19 on other infectious disease threats that we face today. And then in the last few slides, I'm going to focus specifically on my thoughts about where we are with COVID-19 and the role that Texas Biomed is playing during this pandemic. So infectious diseases have arguably been the single most important factor in shaping human evolution. Historically, major pandemics have killed tens of millions of humans and have influenced social migration, and as a result, many genetic factors that define you and me today. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites are the earliest life forms, so they've learned to adapt well beyond the adaptations of humans. Therefore, epidemics and pandemics have plagued humankind since the beginning. Settlers in the 19th century often spoke of cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, and other illnesses causing towns, especially port villages, to quarantine. But some of the earliest epidemics actually date back thousands of years, as shown on this slide. In 3000 BC, an epidemic ravaged a civilization in China that wiped out an entire population, leaving archaeologists to determine that the epidemic was so quick, the dead were not even buried properly. The earliest recorded pandemic was in 430 BC in Athens, Greece, and ended up being a major player in the defeat of the Spartans. Throughout the course of history, outbreaks have ravaged humanity, sometimes changing the course of history, and at times signaling the end of entire civilizations. Today, there are more than 26,000 daily deaths due to infectious diseases, not including COVID, second only to cardiovascular disease and representing approximately 20% of all deaths in the world each year. Among young people under age 50, infections are overwhelmingly the leading cause of death in the world. In addition, infectious diseases account for nearly 30% of all disability-adjusted life years. Not even taking into account COVID deaths, the number of infectious disease and respiratory deaths in the world are more than the daily AIDS and cancer death rates, and the numbers continue to climb. It's now estimated that infectious diseases will be the #1 killer of humans by 2050, exceeding cardiovascular deaths, estimated at a cost of approximately $100 trillion with a T to the global economy and 10 million extra human lives each year. In 1963, a respected physician and anthropologist, Dr. Aidan Cockburn, in a book called The Evolution and Eradication of Infectious Diseases, made the following bold statement, and I quote, "We look forward with confidence to a considerable degree of freedom from infectious diseases at a time not too far in the future. Indeed, it seems reasonable to anticipate that within some measurable time, all the major infections will have disappeared." Well, 5 years later, the US Surgeon General noted that it might be possible with interventions such as antimicrobials and vaccines to quote unquote, close the book on infectious diseases and shift public health resources to chronic diseases. Well, as you can see, even our best public health leaders can make mistakes. In fact, at about that time, there were scattered reports about a very interesting wasting disease among Africans that was first noticed by missionaries. We now realize that these were the early cases of a newly emerging infectious disease that we know as AIDS. Today, AIDS and other infectious diseases continue to pose substantial threats throughout the world. As noted earlier, infectious diseases of many varieties are on the rise. Outbreaks have tripled since the 1980s, with multiple factors contributing to the emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. 30 new infectious diseases have emerged in the last 20 years alone. The top infectious diseases causing human lives are HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. And there are ongoing epidemics of Ebola virus disease. And I'm going to briefly touch on these in the next few slides. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, infects nearly 38 million people around the world today. The global epidemic continues to claim lives, about 1 million lives a year. While effective treatments for HIV exist, there's no vaccine and no effective curative treatments. The current treatments that we have can actually lead to other chronic illnesses, which we have to deal with in the clinic. Even today, many people don't know their HIV status, and HIV continues to spread silently to others. Malaria is a parasitic disease transmitted to humans through the bite of a mosquito. It remains a major killer worldwide, particularly of children. And there is a growing problem of parasite resistance to anti-malarial medications, mosquito resistance to insecticides, and unmet financial needs. After much progress was made in the late 2000 and 2010, innovation in prevention and treatment of malaria have largely slowed, and there is no current vaccine. Estimates of deaths related to disease remain fairly constant at about 500,000 human lives a year. More than 90% of malaria deaths occur in southern and sub-Saharan Africa, and most occur in children of age 5 or younger, where only about 1/3 of children with fever actually ever report to a medical provider. The pace of progress must be accelerated if the global malaria targets for 2020 and beyond are to be reached. Tuberculosis continues to be a major scourge of our time, like malaria and HIV. To date, 1.4 billion with a B people have been killed by tuberculosis, far exceeding any other single infectious disease in history. Annually today, approximately 1.4 million people die from tuberculosis. This is caused by a human-to-human transmissible airborne bacterial infection. Of the 10 million people who become ill with tuberculosis every year, 4 million people don't get the care they deserve. Now, tuberculosis is my area of active research, how it infects the lung, how it's spread, how the bacteria is becoming more and more resistant. Current treatments are long, complicated, and have high toxicity. And there is no current reliable vaccine in the adult population, despite a vaccine on the market since 1924 called the BCG vaccine. There's a major gap in funding, and we desperately need a better vaccine for tuberculosis. The Democratic Republic of Congo recently, in 2018, grappled with the world's second largest Ebola epidemic on record, which occurred just on the heels of the largest epidemic in history that occurred in Western Africa that people in Texas recall all too well. The recent DRC epidemic in 2018 took more than 2,000 lives, with more than 3,400 people infected, and that one just ended. But right on its heels, we have a brand new epidemic that started in June in the northern region of the DRC, and cases are continuing to rise. I want to quote the World Health Organization Regional Director of Africa, who just made this comment the other day, and I quote, "Responding to Ebola in the midst of an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is even more complex. But we must not let COVID-19 distract us from tackling other public health threats that are ongoing and being neglected to some degree." And this is a point that I'll come back to in just a moment. He goes on to say, however, that, quote, "The ongoing Ebola response is also facing funding shortfalls, but significant achievements have been made since the outbreak began. In just 6 weeks, more than 12,000 people have already been vaccinated, while in 2018, it took 2 weeks to even begin vaccinating a small number of people. This time around, vaccination started within 4 days of the outbreak beginning." Now, I believe this last quote highlights the severe importance of completing effective vaccine research and development, like we're attempting to do today with COVID-19. Importantly, I also want you to know that Texas Biomed has played a critical role in Ebola vaccine development, as well as in the new effective therapies being employed in the DRC. And that's something I'm extremely proud of in our scientists at Texas Biomed. Now, while COVID-19 is rightfully top of mind, these other diseases haven't gone away. Just this Sunday, this past week, the New York Times shared a lengthy, I believe, excellent article about new challenges in fighting tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, and other infectious diseases. There's not enough time, money, or resources was the bottom line. Add to these challenges the need to look out for and be ready for the new challenges that emerge, and it's clear that science is under a pressure cooker right now. We know this. We must not only stop COVID-19, we need to develop a better proactive way to handle infectious disease threats. And that's something I'll come back to at the very end. Now, this leads me into how Texas Biomed is taking on the challenge of countering these infectious diseases as outlined on this slide, based on our mission and vision in protecting you and the general public from the threat of infectious diseases. And I'm going to let you peruse this slide while I make a couple of comments. Fundamental research underlies almost everything we do in studying and responding to infectious disease threats. From understanding how infections occur, microvirulence factors, patterns of transmission, and host susceptibility to developing new technologies and countermeasures such as new diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines. Cutting-edge basic research is an essential component of Texas Biomed's enterprise, driving cures for our patients. In particular, advances in genomics and proteomics help us better understand mechanisms of infection, host immunity, and drug resistance, and is helping us to identify new drug targets and develop new diagnostics and vaccines. Progress in synthetic chemistry, robotics, and computer modeling are leading to advances in drug design, high throughput screening, and predictive models of disease transmission. Developments in molecular and genetic epidemiology are helping us understand transmission patterns and host susceptibility. Now, this becomes extremely important because we can now track and trace the evolution of different viruses, for example, across continents. Finally, information technology and AI make an important contribution to all aspects of basic and translational research. At Texas Biomed, we're battling these infectious diseases in a new way and are uniquely positioned to do so, which I will come back to. And while we're making strides, clearly, and it's becoming possible to control or eradicate certain infectious diseases, it seems unlikely that we'll be able to eliminate most emerging infectious diseases in the foreseeable future. Now, in fact, most agree that we're not ready for the next pandemic. Now, I've been giving talks like I am giving today using this particular slide over the past 2 years. And now we know what's on this slide is true. We've been warned. As a global community, we need to be more vigilant and put forth significant resources and efforts earlier to monitor, contain, and study these infectious disease threats. In order to defeat infectious diseases, we need to invest early and often, as with most things. Now we're in a race, but we also have an opportunity to subvert the next pandemic because COVID-19 will surely not be the last. We must continue ongoing research and rapid development and deployment of countermeasures and surveillance tools, diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. Having sufficient resources is essential, and there is currently a huge gap, and this is really our major challenge. Now, in the final few moments, I want to come back and talk specifically about our timeline for COVID-19 and make comments about COVID-19. Now, looking at the timeline on the left-hand side of the slide, it was January 3rd when the first cases in China were reported to the World Health Organization. On January 21st, the US reported its first case. And then we now look fast forward across the slide to the right-hand side, and we're currently in large phase 3 trials of a COVID-19 vaccine. This itself is an unprecedented timescale for our response. So where is science today on COVID-19? Well, we're still trying to understand what this virus is doing to our immune systems. For example, we're now finding out that some people are actually partially protected with so-called cross-reactive antibodies to other common coronaviruses that have been in society for a long time, causing upper respiratory infections. We know now that it's not just about antibodies. Other cells of our immune system are critically important in protection against COVID-19. And just recently, there have been reports of children with COVID-19 that actually have co-infection with other viruses. I believe that trying to understand our body's immune system response to COVID-19 today is our greatest challenge in attempting to develop effective drugs and vaccines at exactly the same time. We do know that COVID-19 is airborne, as droplets and likely as a result of aerosols. I want you to know that decades-long public health research has proven the efficacy of the use of masks, physical distancing, and standard hygiene practices to protect us, or at least limit us from COVID-19 exposure while we're waiting for more effective interventions. Preclinical research is robust worldwide, including validated animal models that are required as part of the FDA portfolio in approving drugs and vaccines, although they receive less attention in the news, something I'm asked about all the time. Texas Biomed got off to a very fast start in March with the very generous contributions of our community partners, and now has 4 validated animal models and is working very quickly 24/7 with Warp Speed companies and the Gates Foundation in new therapies and vaccines. Clinical trials are ongoing. I believe that antibody therapy actually will come much faster than vaccines in the next few months. Vaccines are coming along, however. The current phase 3 clinical trials typically take 3 to 6 months, and I believe will reveal much about how these vaccines work, both good and bad. I believe that we'll learn much about these vaccines in the next 4 to 6 months as a result of these trials, about how effective they are and how durable they are. Manufacturing and prioritization of who gets the vaccine will continue to be a challenge. Bottom line, having everything solved and an available vaccine that protects at least 50% of those who receive it in 2021, I believe is still an extraordinary challenge today. Accurate and available rapid point of care diagnostics also remain a huge challenge that has not been solved. And finally, I believe that all the data to date is telling us that this virus will be with us for a very long time and will not just die out in the population. So what are our current challenges? Well, of course, we start with money. Although I would say that the resources provided by the government as well as the private sector are extraordinary for this pandemic. Time is a challenge. Being reactive in a crisis mode is never good compared to being proactive and prepared. The time pressure also impacts something that absolutely cannot be compromised. And that is any new therapy or vaccine put on the market has got to be thoroughly proven to be safe and effective. The politicizing of science and public health is truly a threat to society, in my opinion. And then there's the challenge of miscommunication. What is new for the current pandemic after being in the business for 40 years is a 24/7 news cycle and focus on early, unvetted scientific progress, which I personally believe leads to confusion and fuels mistrust of science. Now, related to this is the anti-vaccination movement, a growing vocal minority of people who are opposed to vaccinations and are leading to a resurgence of illnesses we once thought we had under control, such as outbreaks of measles in hotspot areas where some parents have refused to vaccinate their children. Some people are swayed to avoid vaccinations based on faulty science, believing in error that vaccines cause autism, for example. Other anti-vaxxers do not trust science in general and pharmaceutical companies in particular, thinking they just want to make a profit on vaccines. Still, other people believe that preventable diseases are not common, so that they don't need any protection. It is important to point out that the anti-vaccination movement is global. It's a global crisis, in fact, making it to the top 10 international public health problems identified by the World Health Organization. Disbelief in vaccines is a definite threat to our COVID-19 vaccine efforts, and current models and surveys suggest that up to 35% of people won't take the vaccine. The bottom line is that vaccines have prevented hundreds of millions of infectious diseases, such as polio, measles, hepatitis B, and meningitis, and can save up to 3 million lives a year. So we have a lot of educating to do, and that's precisely why I accepted and wanted to speak to all of you today. Now, in the last couple of slides, I first want to talk about Texas Biomed's role in all of this. Our scientists perform cutting-edge research to understand infectious diseases and related susceptible populations in order to develop new diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines. Operating under the strictest regulatory guidelines, Texas Biomed has unique facilities, resources, and expertise that cannot be found anywhere else in the world on one campus, and it's here in San Antonio. As a freestanding institute, we have decades of experience in connecting the pipeline of academia and pharma to speed the delivery of science to the clinic. We operate with a flat organizational structure to facilitate nimbleness without bureaucracy, faster, and more complete regulatory science and greater access to decision makers, from our researchers to the president CEO, that's me. Texas Biomed is playing a major role in the trials of therapies and vaccines for the current COVID-19 pandemic by partnering with pharma and early stage research, including, I would add, with our terrific partners in San Antonio. We are aggressively seeking to further advance our facilities and resources to meet the current demand and are prepared for future infectious disease challenges. Finally, we represent the voice of science, facts, not fiction, to provide context, perspective, and accurate information to the public, something critical for Texas Biomed. Let me conclude by saying that infectious diseases are global. Microbes know no man-made boundaries. Since the problem is worldwide, it is going to continue to take a worldwide effort to find solutions. However, our success in stopping the many new emerging diseases that will inevitably occur is definitely not assured. We have many tools in our armamentarium. However, each new disease brings new challenges, forcing us to continually adapt to these ever-changing threats. Thus, the battle against infectious diseases is a continual process. Winning does not mean stamping out every disease, but simply getting ahead of the next one. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I want to turn this back over to Speaker Straus. Thank you.
To wrap up today, I'd like to ask a few questions that are on the minds of all of us as we continue to combat this pandemic. And I'll start with, what do you think caused COVID-19 cases to escalate so significantly in the state of Texas in June and in early July?
Okay, so let's start with a complex question. I actually think there are several answers to that question from my perspective anyway. First is the realization that we're a really large state with a lot of very dense areas of population, which certainly can contribute. We also have a disproportionately high number of vulnerable populations and with significant healthcare disparities, which have added more complexity to getting healthcare timely and in an effective manner. It's true, we've had some uneven reopenings in the state, and really we've had no standard policies either at the state or national level, and I think this has added more challenges for us when we have these increased cases going on today. We've had some really well-documented large gatherings of people who appear to be disregarding the safe practices that I talked about when I made my comments. And this really does hearken to the continued problem of miscommunication that I just talked about.
Dr. Schlesinger, many students and families are beginning a new school year, if not actually returning to campus buildings just yet. Do you believe it's safe for Texas schools to open for in-person learning in the coming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, this is the greatest challenge of today, that's for sure. I want to start with a very simple response by saying it is clear from the data that people of all ages can become infected with this virus and can spread the virus, okay? Children are not excluded. I just want to make that point. We also have to realize that we're in the middle of this pandemic. We're not near the tail end, and that adds more complexity to addressing the issue of whether students should go back to school. Well, of course, we want our children to go back to school. There's no question about that. And it's also clear that each district is going to have to be assessing this very critically on a local level. But one thing's for sure, all resources and policies must be in place before reopening can be considered safe, and that costs a lot of money. I also want to point out something else that's often not talked about. We do talk about how children not returning to school has a negative impact on children. Okay, that's true. But I also would say that children fundamentally rely on and trust their parents to make the right decision. If parents are very uncomfortable with the decision to put their kids in school, children can feel this uncertainty. And I don't think that's a good thing either. So I think right now we have some work to do to decide whether we do hybrid, virtual, or whether in some cases with proper resources in place, we can safely return to school.
From either a state or a federal perspective, what do you think is the most significant action that could be taken but has not been taken to reduce the spread of the virus?
Okay, I'm going to come with a simple answer on that challenging question. I believe both public health officials and political leadership must become much more unified in their approaches to the problem in messaging. I think communication needs to be clearer. I think it needs to be made more simple, transparent, and most importantly, consistent, so that one singular message is heard by the public. There is too much at risk, Joe, for us not to be able to properly message where we are today and the need to practice safe practices to limit the spread.
What are the most important things that we can do as individuals to take action against this?
Well, you know, I think it's the one you've heard about here. Until we have a better therapy, and you heard me say that I'm hopeful that actually therapeutic advances are increasing at a fast pace, particularly antibody therapy. That's going to be a breakthrough for very sick people. I think right now it's everybody, please wear a mask, stop questioning it. Decades of research show its effectiveness, not in eliminating, but reducing risk of transmission. Physical distancing, being outside rather than inside in congregate settings, and safe high or standard practices of hygiene. Please understand the most vulnerable among us, and we know who they are. Protect ourselves, and by doing so, really, I believe this, you are then protecting others.
Larry, you may have touched on this a little bit earlier in your presentation, but why do you think a greater percentage of Americans have died of this virus than in other countries around the world? We're on lists of nations that we're not accustomed to being listed with.
Yeah, I think again, it's got several answers to that from my perspective. It is true that we had the virus in this country and it was spreading silently. Remember, although it was only a few months ago in the Northwest, some of the outbreak that was early. So I think we almost lost the battle at the beginning. We also have a very complex country, state by state. And I do think that we have segments of the population that have demonstrated some mistrust of our leaders with regard to the kinds of things that can protect us. There have been great challenges with the masks in different populations. And as a result, we never really brought the curve down. I think some other countries were aggressive and had policies that were abided by more uniformly than us. There's no question about it. But, I think we really don't need to talk about the past anymore. I don't think that helps us today. Today, we're worried. The public is worried. We need to, at this point forward, make the right decisions and bring those curves down. Otherwise, as Dr. Fauci has said, we're going to have these smoldering outbreaks continuing over many months. And again, as I said, I don't think this virus is going away. So we still have that challenge.
Well, if this virus isn't going away and the fall and the winter are coming, how will this virus and the flu virus that is always introduced at these times of the year, how will they affect each other? Yeah,
this is maybe one of my new biggest concerns, particularly hearing about some reports of co-viral infection in children. And we know that certain segments of children get very severe disease. Let me start by saying that there has been a slowdown in people receiving vaccines for other infectious diseases. Again, the impact of COVID-19 on other infectious diseases. The uptake of the influenza vaccine right now is only about 40%. We must take the influenza vaccine this fall. We have to get those rates up, no question about it, because the symptoms can overlap and we won't know for sure the answer as we enter into the fall and winter season. I've been asked, well, Larry, how often, we're going to have to wear masks forever. The truth is, as we get to know more about COVID-19, we'll be able to focus more and more, like influenza, on populations at severe risk. And eventually, we will have a vaccine if we continue to put forth the efforts, the money, and have everybody leaning in. I hope we don't have money withdrawn and we stop thinking about COVID-19. We need to finish the deal. But I think the winter is going to be quite challenging. And I would start by saying, please vaccinate.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for participating today. And one of the points you made that I heard strongly was the need for very clear communication by leaders. And I don't think that we could have a more clear communicator or better messenger than you are. So I want to thank you again very much for your insight, for the most important work that you're doing at Texas Biomed. We are, the entire world, but especially the community of San Antonio, is counting on you to come through again. So please stay safe, carry on the important mission out there, the critical work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on this conference, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of today's program. Thank you.